Well, I said during the break that I've been given the title of looking at disciplinary knowledge or ways of knowing, whilst following Christine, Stephen and Richard, who've already all spoken about this. So you'll have to bear with it, hearing it again. Clearly we all need to hear it more than 3 times, so here's the 4th time. But before I get into that, I also felt that I needed to give my own analogy. Richard has used juggling, Stephen's used bake-off, and I'm going to allude a little bit to food in my analogy as well. But I was chatting to Fiona yesterday, and I've been reading a book recently for my wider work as Chief Executive of St Gabriel's about grant making and what it means to be a modern grant maker. And quite often charities will design a strategy and they'll work with it and they'll keep going with it for years and years and years and years and not look perhaps at the changes in context and so on that they are sort of faced with, if you like. And so they just keep going as they've always done things. Now, in this book called Modern Grant Making, what the authors present is an idea of thinking about grant making as being a service for other people. And they give this great analogy, and I think this is also helpful for thinking about curriculum. So let me explain it first in terms of grant making. So they talk about being an architect or a chef. An architect designs a house, okay, spends quite a lot of time, talks to you about it and so on, and comes up with this amazing design. You then have your house or whatever else it is you're having designed built. And you then live in it and you realise the stairs are in the wrong place. But you put up with it because you've spent a lot of time and money probably on your architect. So you just put up with it for a very, very long time, but eventually you decide you need to change it. Okay. Now, the book is saying that some grant makers, some charities are a bit like that. Okay. However, a better model is to think of ourselves as grant makers as chefs. Every time a chef produces their meal, they are producing the best service, the best food that they possibly can for you. Each time they are making that meal, they're thinking the ingredients they're using are the best quality possible. How they perhaps even arrange it on the plate is the most beautiful it can possibly be before they serve it to you. And they're continually doing this daily. Okay, it's a daily practice. It's not something that they just do and then they leave and forget about for however long, perhaps a bit more like the architect. And it got me thinking that this model could also be useful for thinking about curriculum. When you were all sharing about who you were yesterday and where you've come from and so on, I just noted that a few of you said, we haven't looked at our curriculum for such a long time. And there were valid reasons for doing that, obviously. But it reminded me of this analogy that actually perhaps some of us have become a little bit more like architects and we just left it. But actually, it's a continual journey. It's like being that chef, if you like, and continue going back to our curriculum. And both Stephen and Richard this morning have actually alluded to that idea, that this whole idea of the curriculum being transitioned continually. It's a continual journey that we are on. So I offer you, instead of juggling and bake-off, I offer you the architect and chef analogy. And I might even write a little blog about it, which will get posted probably next week. So, disciplinary knowledge or ways of knowing. Some of you will already know quite a lot about this already. Certainly you've heard about it in the last few hours and last night a little bit as well. So what I'm going to do is touch perhaps a little bit more on some practical examples of what this would look like from work that I have been involved in, but also perhaps present some provocative questions, questions which I still have about this myself, and I don't have answers to. If you like, this is me being the chef as well, going, I'm not quite sure that's quite the right ingredient anymore for that. I need to find a different ingredient. So a little bit of context first of all. Some of you might have seen my blog where I use an analogy of a tapestry. It's not a perfect analogy at all. But what I really felt when I read the Ofsted Research Review is, what is the relationship between the substantive knowledge the disciplinary or ways of knowing and personal knowledge. What's the relationship between them? And I tried to think about this in a visual way. And I thought of a tapestry, and it's not quite the perfect image, but it was the one that we had copyright permission to use. What I really wanted was a tapestry that kind of broadened out as it sort of went along. It wasn't all straight. And I also wanted one that didn't have quite such a set pattern on it, something that was perhaps a little bit more fluid, a little bit more messy, if you like. But the warp, so the line's going this way, okay, on the weaving, they're the ones that kind of have the structure, if you like, for your curriculum. So the substantive knowledge, the content, if you like, okay. But the disciplinary, or the ways of knowing, are woven through that content as you go through. So as you look at pieces of content, what you are doing is you are asking different questions, okay, as you go through about that content, and as the pupils are interacting with that content themselves and developing their own personal self-understanding. Okay, I'm not going into detail about substantive and personal knowledge today, but that's what I think is happening when you bring these three things together. And the reason I've got the tapestry is that this then demonstrates, if you like, your curriculum and progression over time. So the tapestry grows and develops over time. But it doesn't mean you can't change some of the warp, or you can't change some of the weft as you go along. That's why I wanted something that was a little bit more organic, if you like, rather than this kind of structured pattern. So I wanted to explain that because I wanted to explain where I see these ways of knowing or disciplinary knowledge in relationship to the substantive and the personal knowledge. So I realise you won't be able to read this slide, but don't panic. There is a link later on, and I've said to Fiona, these slides will be shared, okay, so you'll be able to click on a link. This is from the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus, and this syllabus is publicly available. So anyone can access the syllabus online, and you can get this exact page. So what exactly do we mean by this kind of multidisciplinary or ways of knowing? Now, I need to say that this syllabus was written it was written really in 2018, before the Commission on RE, and then became statutory in 2019. So again, it was a moment in time. And this whole idea of coming back to our curriculum and seeing in transition means I might not use exactly the same language now if I was doing it again, okay? So I might prefer to use ways of knowing, perhaps, as well as referring to disciplinary knowledge, okay? So just bear that in mind, that this is a moment in time. But what do we mean by these ways of knowing? Now, others have touched on this already this morning, so I don't want to go into it in too much detail. But what we're talking about is these kind of intellectual traditions that have grown up. Focusing on particular objects of investigation, and in particular these different methods or tools that we bring to the study of religion and worldviews. And I really liked the references that people have made this morning already to the idea that we want the pupils in our classrooms to become the researchers. But first of all, we perhaps need to think of ourselves in that role first. Okay, so we are the researchers ourselves as teachers, engaging with these different ways of knowing ourselves, understanding them to at least some degree, before we're then thinking about how we're going to do that with our pupils. So this is just a summary, and I'm going to just show you what that might look like as an example. Again, this is from the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus, and we have a page like this for three key disciplinary areas, so theology, philosophy, and what we've called human and social sciences, where we've included history as part of that. Others have separated history out. To be quite honest, I don't mind how you organise your disciplines. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later, in that I don't think they need to be quite so structured in this way, which is why I think ways of knowing is helpful. But what these pages do is to set out what we mean by each of these disciplines. So explaining in more detail what that means. So the body of knowledge that might be included here. So if you like, more of the core, the content, if you like, as well as the research methods or the disciplinary focus of that in terms of how people understand the truth claims or how make sense of the religion and worldview. So things like, these have already been mentioned, but things like coherency of texts. Stephen referred to Simeon Zahl talking about that. But what's important here as well, and why we've included it for Norfolk, was this idea that actually we need to be engaging with what is going on in this research. So these are just some examples, so theology and divinity departments, for example, those specialising in particular theological traditions, whether that's Islamic, Hindu, Jewish, and so on. Theos think tank, they are focusing particularly on the importance of understanding religion, particularly Christianity, but not exclusively, in the public sphere. Are we reading things that are coming out from them? And obviously, we've been really developing links in the RE community with TRS UK and also with BASA, which is the British Association for the Study of Religion as well. They focus more on the sociological side, for example. TRS are more focused, but not exclusively, on the theological side. So engaging with those groups within our own community together. And there's one other little caveat, since, again, this all shows curriculum in transition, so it's actually quite a nice example. I'm actually using the phrase thinking about and thinking through believing now to describe theology, not just thinking through believing, but thinking about and thinking through, okay? And if you've read the Reforming RE book, you'll know that in there, Gillian Giorgio and I use that kind of language to describe. And if you want to know more about this in a little bit more detail, I would recommend getting that book and reading that chapter, and also chapters by others in the room, including Richard. I think he referred to his chapter earlier. So these are a few thoughts. Again, this is my sort of reflections back on the last couple of months, really, and some conferences I've been to where I've been really beginning to think this through a little bit more. And again, the first one of these, I think, is something that other people have mentioned already this morning. We need, if we're going to look at disciplinary knowledge, we need to understand where we are coming from to this. Many, many years ago, when I was thinking about doing a PhD, I contemplated the idea of researching secondary teachers and looking at how their degree that they had done might influence the curriculum that they designed. I really wish I'd done that now, but I didn't. I changed my mind and did something on pedagogy. How illuminating might that have been, actually? And the reason I wanted to do that was because I had been helping on a university PGCE course, and I'd come across a brilliant anthropologist who was marvellous in the classroom when using an anthropological kind of point of view or looking at anthropology and sort of the study of religion in that way. But faced with theology, found it really challenging. So the first thing is, do we tend to do things that perhaps we're more comfortable with, or perhaps where our passion is, rather than it being a more balanced approach? I confess I'm a theologian, and so that would be another thing that I would probably go towards. But something else that I've touched on here as well, and I can't remember now, it was Richard or Stephen also picked this up, is that the ways of knowing are also rooted in, if you like, a more society's kind of worldview perspective as well. And we live in the West, okay? And a lot of our disciplinary ways of thinking are rooted in those perspectives as well. So it's not just about, when we're thinking about perhaps moving towards a more worldviews approach, which I believe is more inclusive and looks at the diversity and complexity of religion, actually we need to think about how we're thinking about ways of knowing as well in the same way. So we might think, for example, about decolonizing, for example, the curriculum. There are different ways in which we might approach that. But how are we thinking about that in terms of disciplines as well? Philosophy in the West is not necessarily understood or regarded in the same way as it is in other parts of the world. Are we just using what we might call traditional Western theological approaches rather than using other ways of thinking about how religion is studied in other parts of the world, as well as our own? And perhaps not just in other parts of the world, perhaps even within our Western frameworks, marginal groups, marginal theology, if you like. How can we explore some of those aspects as well? So this has really got me thinking that, this is also quite complex. And adds another sort of level of challenge. I've been really interested that Nikki has been reading some Womanist Theology as part of her sort of wrestling that we're talking about. I was really fascinated by Womanist Theology. It was part of my own study. Is this something that we could think about, for example? So this is why I think personal knowledge, kind of self-awareness of our positionality, is vital for pupils, but it's also really vital for teachers as well, okay, to think about that. So, I will come to this slide in just a moment. Before I do that, I just want to give a little anecdote from my own experience. I think quite a lot of us actually already do a lot of this already. We just haven't been intentional about it. When I was doing my A-level RE, it was a long time ago, we studied John's Gospel and the history of Christianity. I think it was from about 1870 to 1970, okay? And there was these two distinct things. And in the John's Gospel piece of the work, we were largely looking at it theologically, okay? It was largely, in its sense, it was like almost partly a theology A-level, really. But in the other part of the course, it was really what you might call much more sociological, particularly historical things that we were looking at and methods that we were using and so on as part of looking at sources, all those kind of type things, whereas the theology was much about its coherence and significance and so on. Now, my teachers at the time, and as a sort of 17, 18-year-old, that was never made explicit to me. I didn't know that that's what I was doing, but actually, that is what I was doing. I was using, actually, this growing toolkit, if you like, that I could draw upon to help make sense and understand John's Gospel and the history of Christianity. So I think that for many of us, some of us may have grown up with those sorts of things and doing that sort of thing in our, and it's not been made explicit. I think part of this is about making this much more explicit. So here is an example of some thinking around this. One of the big things for me at the moment is thinking about moving towards more of a worldviews approach, okay? And I think there are huge challenges with this, and I don't have all the answers yet, so I really want to stress that. But I think the work around big ideas can be particularly helpful. So what I have done with this slide is just to take one big idea, which is referenced in the proposed statement of entitlement in the Commission RE report as well, which is around change. And it uses this phrase, beliefs, expression and belonging change across and within worldviews. And what you might do is then to think about what are the different questions we might ask about change across time. And there's no, I want to stress that there's no coherence to the questions going across here. They're just examples for here, okay? You would need to think about how are you going to link one to the other. But the key thing is not to some degree, the knowledge of each particular worldview that's being developed. It's the overarching concept of change that is absolutely vital. So if you like, the ambitious end point, so a phrase that still often use, is about this top blue line here, the beliefs, expression, belonging change across and within worldviews. That is what you want the pupils to be able to understand. Okay? And then you would look at that through different disciplinary or different ways of knowing, different questions that are being asked there. Okay? So some more theological, some more human social science, some more philosophical. And then I've dug a little bit deeper. So what I have here is a very specific example. Again, I've taken the theme of change, but this time I've looked through a social human science lens specifically, and I focus on a local area study, because I think this could link really nicely, particularly in primary, with history. Okay? So I've then taken this from early years to Key Stage 3. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, because you can obviously have the slides later. But in early years, what I would love the children to do is to talk to people in the local community about what sort of religion looked like in their locality as they have lived there. I'd love the children just to have a conversation with people about that. You know, has it changed? Is the local church still in the same place, or is it now become something else, a community hub or a food bank or whatever it happens to be, for example? In Key Stage 1, I might decide to take a festival, for example. I'm using a largely Christian theme on this example here, but perhaps taking something like Christmas. How people, again, I really want to encourage encounter. I've talked about grandparents and parents here, for example, the children might talk to. Is it celebrated in the same way now as it was in the past? Okay. Remember, this is human social science that we're focusing on. So this is the how is it being celebrated. And then lower Key Stage 2, perhaps looking at local places of worship in the locality. Are they the same and different? In my own village, where I live, there were 4 active places of worship a number of years ago. When we first moved into the village, 16 years ago, there were 3, and now there are 2. All the buildings still exist, but only 2 are now active. Okay, that's a change. Why is that? Okay. Then upper Key Stage 2, perhaps looking at a change over time in a much broader sense. Okay, and then Key Stage 3, I've suggested looking at something like census data, for example, and considering the impact perhaps of secularisation or postmodernism, but again, perhaps doing some really in-depth qualitative research with local people about how things have changed. So this is just one example, okay, to show you how you might take one disciplinary lens with one theme right across the different key stages. But it is just an idea. Okay, and I should say that's separate from the Norfolk syllabus. What I just showed you is not in the syllabus. But in the Norfolk syllabus, we've dug sort of much deeper than that as well. You've got part slides here because these pieces of work are only really available for those that sign up for the actual syllabus and get these particular resources. I have some things that I'm going to share with you a little bit later, which aren't for wider sharing. But what we've got here is just some further examples of how you might take this idea of change across time. This one is a philosophy-focused unit, thinking about why do people have different ideas about God, okay? And again, this concept of change. So this is a Key Stage 1 example. Note there we've also picked out keywords and the core knowledge that we want the children to develop. These 2 different ones are from Key Stage 2, so a theology one, where do Christian religious beliefs come from? And then a disciplinary focus on human social sciences. Why is there so much diversity of belief within Christianity? Okay. And again, we've got the keywords, the vocabulary there, and some exemplar learning activities. And then finally, a Key Stage 3 one. Just use an example again, human social science. How do Christians interact with culture? Okay, so all of these are actually focused on the concept of change. The Norfolk Agreed syllabus didn't design it that way, actually. It's just kind of happened, okay, when I was looking and reflecting on it in preparation for this. And this is, again, this is publicly available on the Norfolk syllabus, and it does have Key Stage 1 and 2 as well. I've just put Key Stage 3 on the slide here so that you could see something. But what Norfolk have done is to make sure there is a balance between these different disciplinary lenses, because their argument is, their kind of ambitious goal at the end is that pupils will become religiously, I would say religiously and worldview literate, okay, at the end. So that's the ultimate aim, if you like. And to do that, they've balanced theological questions, philosophical questions, and human social science questions. So the theology ones are that sort of, I don't know, salmon-y colour, I suppose. The philosophy in blue, and the green ones are more human social science focused. And the idea here is that the units do build on one another. Hopefully you can see that. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just move on. And again, just to say, other people are doing work on this, some of whom are in the room and referenced on my slide, including, I mean, Stephen referred to some of the books earlier. Dawn's and Louise's book has got some great examples of this. And then after today, if you want to use this, you can see I've referenced a Norfolk Agreed syllabus there as well, so you'll be able to access all of that. So, a couple of things just to finish on. I think it was Richard who talked about Joe Pearce and Alexis Stone's work earlier. But this is one of my favourite quotes, and it sums up for me so well why this is really important. I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to read the highlighted bits to you. So what they're talking about is what an 18-year-old should be able to do when they kind of finally leave your RE classroom. You could say 16-year-old perhaps as well. The first thing is that they've considered looking at religion and worldviews through a range of lenses. So using the word lens, we could use ways of knowing. But also, they recognise that there are different lenses and how to apply at least some of them appropriately. Again, it's acknowledging that we can't possibly, it might be multidisciplinary, we're probably not going to be able to cover all the disciplines. And they should be able to develop a greater understanding of distinct natures and purposes of those lenses, so they understand what theology, etc., are doing, as well as to develop a more in-depth and sophisticated knowledge in terms of their application. In the end, whether she decides to do that is up to her. A purpose of RE is to make that a viable option. I think this is a really powerful quote. I find it really helpful. But I want to end with the elephant in the room, for me at least. It might not be for you. Assessment. Where do we go with that? There's lots of smiles in the room for this one. I think for me, the big question I have at the moment is, what are we ultimately aiming to do? What are our ambitious end goals? What question is it that we are wanting to ask of our pupils at the end of their time with us? And I think there are actually some different things that we might ask, okay? One of the things I've been pondering is the idea that we are encouraging or enabling children and young people to become really good or expert interpreters of religion and worldviews. I really love the way that we're thinking more about personal knowledge and the fact that we are thinking about who am I who is coming to this particular piece of content that I'm studying, and thinking about and what tools and methods am I using when I come to that. How can I be a better interpreter of religion and worldviews? And I'm playing around myself with that idea. I may well change my mind in a few months' time, who knows? But that's what I'm playing around with. And if I have that as my ambitious end goal, I think I can begin to think about, well, what are the steps that I need to be able to see in order for a young person to achieve that, to be a really great expert interpreter of religion and worldviews. Thank you.